The difference between Romanesco and Italian. All right, that's a question of the difference between what is called a dialect and what is a national language. And that relates to two other questions. What is the difference between a dialect and a language? And as far as translation goes, how to translate a dialect. As far as the question of the difference between Romanesco, the dialect, and Italian, Romanesco and Italian have common ancestry, so they can vie as equals on that common ancestry, which is Latin. When Dante in the 14th century wrote in his Tuscan dialect, and he was followed by Petrarch writing sonnets, sonetti, in Tuscan or Florentine dialect, and then Boccaccio, all in the 14th century, the Florentine Tuscan dialect became the literary language, or the literary dialect, I really should say, of Italy, rather than some of the other dialects. And there are dozens of dialects in Italy. The dominant one being, because of the literary ancestry, being Tuscan or Florentine. And some of them are mutually incomprehensible, such as, say, people in Rome or in Florence would have no idea how to speak to somebody speaking native Sicilian. It's probably more difference between some of the dialects spoken in Italy than there is between Spanish and Portuguese. It's that different. But anyway, the Tuscan dialect began to be thought of as Italian in a literary sense, even though a small minority of the people living in Italy spoke it. And then in 1871, the national armies, who had thrown out the Austrian-Hungary emperors, marched into Rome, and they seized the city from the Pope, and they made Rome the capital of Italy, and they declared that the Tuscan, much written in Florentine dialect, would be the national language of Rome. Of Italy. And that's how all these other languages became dialects, partly because of the literature and partly because of the politics. Well, to go back to the early 1800s, there was a poet named Giuseppe Bedley, who was not from Rome, but he was living in Rome, and he was writing poetry. He was writing poetry in the Florentine dialect of Dante. And he had this problem. His poetry stunk, and it was dull, it was listless, he didn't have any passion to it. And meanwhile, he was very interested in, he had become interested in the language or the dialect of the ordinary working people all around him there in Rome. They were speaking a language which was known as Romanesco. And so the Romanesco, the peoples who spoke Romanesco were speaking this sort of unacknowledged language. But very interesting to this poet, Bedley, and he started writing sonnets in this Romanesco dialect. And all of a sudden, he was able to write with sarcasm and with intensity, with passion, and with great intelligence. By doing that, he, even though he was writing saucy poems, he sort of declared that from now on, Romanesco could be a literary language, although not respectable the way Italiano was, or the way the Florentine dialect was. So with that precedent, other poets followed. And in the mid-1970s, Miller Williams, who had a fellowship to live in Rome with the with the Roman Academy discovered Giuseppe Nobile and translated this wonderful book by Bedley, with on one side Bailey's Romanesco, on the other side Miller Williams's translation. I don't know how much the future of Romanesco is. Giorgio de Roberti believed, and I met him, he believed passionately that there would always be Romanesco, but it's noticeable that the language that Bedley wrote, this is the language of this 19th century poet who first started writing in Romanesco, his language is further from standard Italian than Giorgio Roberti's is. Even as the dialects in Italy seem to be spoken less, poets in Italy are discovering more and more what Bedley discovered in the early 1800s, that he could write, and that they're discovering that they can write in their dialects with a kind of a passion, an interest that they weren't able to write in standard Italian. All'ultimo uscirà una sonagera d'angiole, e come si s'annassi a letto, smorzeranno gli lumi, e buonasera. Now, what Fortunado told me about this line is that there's that buonasera, good night, which in Italian is buonasera, it's diphthonged, buonasera. And he said that was much lighter, whereas the buonasera, the undiphthonged o, was stronger. Well, I sort of see that, but it doesn't strike me the way it would a native. But that's, to somebody from Italy, they would hear that as Romanesco, and that would bring to mind the tough, rough life of the Roman working man, maybe, something like that.